Hello, everyone, and welcome. We're delighted to welcome you to this Zoom webinar from the USC US-China Institute, which is being simulcast on Facebook Live. I'm Clayton Doobie. I work for the USC US-China Institute, and we're delighted that you're with us. And we know that you're with us because David Barboza is with us. And it is a distinct pleasure to have David with us today. You folks all know, of course, something of his background, his distinguished work as a journalist for the New York Times, working first in the United States, then in China, serving as the bureau chief of the Times in Shanghai for a number of years. You know that he received a couple Pulitzer Prizes in a single year, one of them for his expose of the Wen Jiabao family fortune and talking about dismantling that, not dismantling the fortune, but uncovering the fortune and sharing that with us. But he's also received awards for his other reporting on environmental and other concerns. Even before going to China, he wrote about Enron's meltdown and was part of a team that won awards for that. He's with us today, coming to us from his home office, and we're delighted to bring him with us today. He's going to be talking with us about the Chinese economy, the difficulties of reporting on the Chinese economy, on talking about the Chinese economy, and we'll get into this new venture that he's launched, The Wire China, which is a new news and information service that is available at The Wire China, and you can check it out as you watch. All of you who are watching via Zoom are welcome to participate by submitting questions. Now you'll need to type those questions. Just click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. That'll open up a Q&A form, and you can just go ahead and type in your question. Initially, David and I will just talk about a couple of different things here, but please submit your questions and we will address as many of them as we can. So first of all, David Barboza, thank you so much for being with us today.
Great to be here, Clayton.
Yeah, many of you know, of course, about David's work from reading the Times, but perhaps you also saw an interview that he did with us back in 2015 about his work. And you can see that interview in the Assignment China episode, Follow the Money. So definitely take a look at that. Well, first of all, congratulations on The Wire China. I look forward to talking more about your strategy there, why you think it's important to launch it, and why now. But if you could, would you mind saying a few things about the state of China's economy today, given that China suffered for the first time in better than 30 years a downturn in its GDP growth, something that had never happened before. And so not in 30, in this long stretch. And so perhaps you can give us a snapshot view of the economy today. And because you were on the ground in China at the time of the great financial crisis, perhaps you could compare it with the challenges China faced then.
Sure. So if I think back to 2008, 2009, as you know, the Olympics were in 2008 in the summer. I covered the Olympics in August, and it was pretty soon after the Olympics that the financial crisis started to hit China and the rest of the world. What I remember about that time was that almost everything closed down. I mean, not like today, but there was a big hit in China, I would say, at the end of 2008. And I remember people telling me that state-owned companies and even private companies were told, you can't lay anyone off. No one would come to work, or they don't need to come to work, but you're not going to have layoffs. You're not going to have this, what's going on in the US happen. So everyone sort of holds still with like the government had mandated this situation. And then they started pumping money into the economy. And at that time, as you know, the China was more of an export-led economy. I would say it was becoming an entrepreneurial economy, but nothing like today. And so the state maybe had many more levers to do that. And I think it was, up to 2008, it had been supercharged with growth. And one of the big differences, I think, between now and then is, although the economy has diversified, they have been struggling with debt for quite a while. I mean, some of it going back to that 2008, 2009 period where they pumped so much money into the economy. So obviously, this situation is completely different. It is more like, you can't even get people to go to work in some cases, but they certainly don't have the problems that we have in the US or in the rest of the world. It seems that China has actually done better. So I'm not on the ground. It's hard for me to really assess what it feels like in China during this crisis. It's just kind of observing that how they're in a different stage. In the financial crisis, it was sort of the fault of Americans and the fault of Wall Street, right? Where now everyone is putting the blame on China, or at least the US wants to blame China and say this whole disaster is China's fault and they will pay. I think actually one of the things that I've been thinking about is not so much how the economic situation is different, but how the environment is different, right? And right now, it is very almost scary that the tensions between the US and China over trade, over IP theft, over all sorts of universities, everything is kind of coming out at one time. And I can't think of another time when so much has been aimed at China. And of course, China is aiming some of that stuff back at the US and others. So the atmosphere is, if you're going to look at the economy and the effects of what's going on during this crisis, you have to factor in all of those other things. Like we're writing in The Wire about listings in the US of Chinese companies. Mm-hmm. Well, Trump is talking about, not allowing them to list in the US. Rubio and Cotton are talking about Chinese should not be at American universities, maybe, or at least fewer of them, at least for Cotton's position. So the environment is so toxic, and I have to think that that's going to affect the economic recovery. Global supply chains, will people decide we've got to reroute the global supply chains? More things have to move out of China? 2008, 2009, we're going to get over it and still everything is going to flow into China. It's going to be produced there, resourced there, the workers are there. Everyone was rushing to China. And actually, once the economy got going, it was even a bigger run up in the Chinese economy. So you really kind of wonder in today's situation whether that period is over, right? Which is, when I was in China, everyone is going to build everything in China. There's no alternative. And now is there an alternative? Will there be an alternative? Is it a national security risk? What was okay to invest in China in 2008 and 10 and 12 may be a dangerous thing to allow to happen. Also, back in 2008 and 9, many Americans would go to China and they would say, there's no innovation here. They will never compete on technology. They're way behind. They're just going to copy everything. And now all of a sudden everyone's saying, no, they're actually ahead of us in technology and AI, and we've got to learn from them. And they work harder. They 996 is in China. It's not in the US. So it is a dramatic difference that we see today in our perceptions of China, of the state of the economy, of their ability to push back against the US, but also the US is throwing everything at China right now. And even under the Trump administration from year one, I didn't think it would ever get this bad.
No, it is astonishing how quickly you can start rolling downhill.
Right.
And that's very much where we are today. And so you've just highlighted that, comparing 2008 with 2020, big differences. First of all, in the international environment, and specifically in terms of US-China ties, and that's more difficult. And compare that with 2008, where you have summits, where you're gathering leaders together, coming up with maybe not coordinated, but at least talking to each other about working separately, but in the same direction towards providing stimulus. So you definitely have a different international environment. And of course, China is today the #1 trading partner for so many different countries. And many more countries depend on China as a customer than they once did. So you have that international difference. And then you also highlighted that China's different, that the Chinese economy is different, that it's much more consumer driven than it once was, and that you've got all this different kind of innovation. Very much, the new economy has a lot of presence in China. So you've made it very clear. Now, one of the things that was striking in what you said for 2008 was the government saying, keep people employed. This is not open for discussion. Keep people employed. And with the lockdown, and I met with people in January. I was in China briefly in January and then had friends visit, and they were very concerned about the sorts of businesses that ultimately did go down. Half a million small and medium-sized enterprises seem to have vanished. They've either formally declared bankruptcy or just ceased to exist. And so I'm curious, what that means in terms of the recovery. If there's no business to go back to, because this was a very different situation. Businesses actually closed their doors and people were to stay at home. So I'm curious what you think in terms of how China comes out of this crisis. We see it, things starting to return to semi-normal in many places, but how quickly a recovery are we looking for?
I want to preface it by saying I'm obviously not an economist, but one of the things that I have noticed over the years is, I remember going back to that 2008, 2009 period, that one of the things I was surprised at about being on the ground is China was censoring the media coverage of the financial crisis. Not completely, but enough that you didn't feel as nervous about, when you have a financial crisis or when you have this lockdown, a lot of things are driven about how people's psychology works. Is I turn on the TV, I look at Twitter, do all these things, and I get scared and I stop spending, right? If you don't have an open, and I'm not arguing for censorship, but if you don't have a free press and the government censors and they control the flow of information, there may be, at least in their mind, the benefit of people are not panicking. And also, as you know, they don't exactly have an open economy. They have their capital account. They have a lot of restrictions on getting money out. If they just opened up and said, like, money can flow in and out, they might have, the whole economy might sink because so much money flew out of the country. So they have different levers and tools that the US doesn't have, that other countries don't have, including the ability to mask the true depth of the downturn. I believe actually in that 30 years, they had other downturns, not as severe as the one now. They just didn't report that they were that severe. And sometimes they underreported the growth. Because I remember when I was in China, they were growing 10%, but people said, no, they're actually going 12 or 15%. So they can manipulate the earnings in a way. up and down, and they also have different tools. So I tend to think, in my experience, that China does have an advantage in rebounding because you've got 1.4 billion often very hungry people, hardworking. The government has a lot of levers. And also they do have the benefit, by the way, that almost everything is made in China, right? So even if they just seized everyone's factories, they would like produce everything that they would need. So I think it's interesting to me to think that after all that time that I spent in China, that so many industries just went full blown, it's all going to be in China, or a huge percentage. And that people didn't say to themselves, well, at what point does it become a risk? Like, for instance, as we wrote about antibiotics, if everything is in China, if there's nowhere else to get an iPhone because it's only made in China, and we need the batteries, we need all of the other parts. So I mean, a lot of argument now is being made about national security and other things, but I just think as that evolves, China builds up its capabilities, it has the factories, it has the know-how. And if the US or any other country wants to restructure that, it is a huge undertaking. Like, good luck in thinking that you can bring back antibiotics manufacturing or medical supplies, or all the other things are pretty difficult. And I guess one of the stories I've been thinking about a lot for our magazine is to look back and try to understand how those things evolved and whether those were the right decisions. And what are the consequences of China being the world's manufacturing hub, even if it's not a bad relationship. I'm just assuming, like, as we did, that the US-China relationship was improving. They were being integrated into the global economy. They were going to become almost like an ally. We didn't expect that, no, there would be some turn, maybe beginning in the Obama years, that China would become the rival, enemy of the US, and now made into an evil empire or something. So that is quite a dramatic shift, especially if you consider, well, the evil empire has all of our goods. We're not making things here for the most part. We ship it all there and then they ship it back. So this is, as I think I said before we started this session, it is not just the most important relationship, but so much is at stake in understanding how China and the US work together, how the global economy works, all the questions that you need in the relationship. And in the future, there's kind of no better time to examine those.
Well, you make so many important points here. I want to remind viewers that you're able to participate by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen and typing in your questions. We really do welcome them. Supply chains. You've just emphasized, the global dependence on China as a manufacturing hub. And that's something, of course, that, has taken decades to build, and once built has, its own heft, right?
Mm-hmm.
The sorts of expertise that you need, the sorts of raw materials, all concentrated in these various places. But as you've suggested with regard to antibiotics and other things, these supply chains, although they may be able to deliver goods just in time, just when we want them, right? They're fragile. If something such as this or some other disruption emerges. And so companies are likely to stay in China. The China market is huge. Why would they abandon that? There's no logic to that. But for purposes of adding resiliency, you might want to have another supplier somewhere else. You might need to do those kinds of things. In your reporting thus far, have you heard these kinds of discussions?
Well, as you know, it's when you think about the supply chain. So the idea, I guess, was in the early days, right? China had set up the system where it welcomed in global manufacturing, so that goods could be made cheaply in China. You could hire Chinese workers, and then those goods would be shipped out of China. And actually, if you wanted to sell the goods that you were making in China to Chinese, you had to actually ship them out of China and then re-import them into China, which was a big hassle. So at the beginning stage,
and you got tax,
and you got a high tax of
benefits,
VAT.
all kinds
Yeah,
of
you got subsidies and free land and all those things to make your goods here, hire our workers, and ship it out. We don't want to buy it. And then it was the phase of now you can export your goods to America and Europe, but also we have a China market that's growing, and more of those goods are going to start to be consumed by the Chinese, right? And then as things got bigger and more expensive, the companies did start diversifying, and they said, well, we want to have, the cost of labor is actually rising in southern China. We should move inland to China, or we should move to Southeast Asia or Vietnam or Thailand or all these, Cambodia, all these other places, India, etc. And so there has been diversification for those lower, sort of lower skilled jobs, textiles, toys, and those kind of things. But at the time that I was there, China was trying to move up the value chain, right? It said, let's do the more sophisticated, let those, like, we don't want to make t-shirts anymore. Let those things go. We want to
this
make.
is the new normal, right?
Yes,
We want to
yes.
move up,
Yes.
quality over quantity.
That's right. That's right. And often, by the way, lots of Chinese companies moved to Southeast Asia and they said, this is really difficult. Let's move back to Hunan or some central China. Actually, that's like another country. Move inland and let the coastal cities move up into real estate and financial services, but also manufacturing cars and equipment, higher value things. And so there has been this diversification. But as China, I guess smartly in a way, moved away from just the low value, I mean, they captured the low value and actually didn't want it all. And some of it was very highly polluting. They started moving into everything else, and pretty successfully. And as you may know, they also lured global companies, just like they're still doing with Tesla, and said, we will give global companies subsidies. So when people say the Chinese government gives state-owned companies subsidies or Chinese companies subsidies to export to the rest of the world, I say they also give companies like Apple subsidies. And I wrote about Apple's subsidies. Well, direct subsidies to Foxconn, which is making primarily for Apple in Hunan province. So China has used land policy subsidies to move up the value chain, to capture a lot of these things. And I think the deals were so good that for a lot of global companies, they said, look, China's the biggest market. It's going to be the biggest economy. We want to make it a lot of that for China, but they've also given us such a great deal that they will also lower the cost for us and raise the profits if we make things for outside. So China has pretty much captured a lot of the key supply chains. And when you visit those supply chains throughout the country and you see everything in the supply chain is all lined up, it's pretty hard to pull it out, right? I mean, even in clothing, like we have the button makers here and we have the stitchers here, and it's all in one city. You can do all of these things. I remember my first trips to China were to T-shirt city, and there was actually an underwear city and a bra city. We specialize only in bras, only in T-shirts, only in ties. So they have that kind of, integration and supply chain that makes it dominant. So if we're entering a situation now where people are rethinking all those things, especially because of the US-China relationship, I just don't know how long would it take people talk about decoupling. I don't even know if that's possible in the next 10 years, but that will be a very painful, expensive process. And it's not like there's another China sitting there waiting. I mean, I don't think India is just going to take all of that stuff in and become the next China that easily. So there's a lot to think about. And I think, though, that it's possible we're at the beginning of not decoupling, but rewriting the global supply chain, or restructuring the global supply chain, and rethinking about what do we want to be globally produced and what do we want to be close to home for security reasons, for health reasons, for other reasons. And that is going to be a mammoth process, because the way we saw things from the late 90s until, say, 2015 or 16, flowing into China, that it's really some of the capabilities maybe are not even in the US to take some of these things back.
Well, and you've highlighted the obvious challenges with that. And I think that you're obviously quite correct in suggesting that decoupling, I don't believe it's possible. You're looking at $500 to $600 billion in two-way trade. On an average day, 8,000 Chinese, an average pre-COVID-19 day, 8,000 Chinese come to the United States to visit, to spend money, to do different things, to do business, and 6,000 Americans go to China. We are very much intertwined, but it seems likely that, as you describe it, there's going to be sectors where there's going to be some retooling of those supply chains.
Right.
And when you look at this, when you look at the tensions in the United States, the heightened political fervor over China, all of these sorts of things, and you think about innovation. Now, this is something you mentioned early on, talking about China now as an innovation power. And you've got a number of books with something like that in the title, right? What does this rivalry do to innovation? Does it stimulate it? Does it stifle it? Do we move forward? What happens?
Great question. I think it's actually one of the most important subjects of the year, of the next 5 years. Because if you think about, just take out the word innovation and just say science and technology. Right. And if you think about, well, where does that happen and how does that happen now? We know the US and China are leaders in developing internet-related companies, technology companies, biotech companies. They're both pretty strong. We know that the US universities have something like 350,000 students from China. You know that the medical schools, the engineering schools, the computer science programs, many of the graduate students schools are dominated by people from India and China. So let's just say we go back 3 years, and there aren't the tensions that there are now, and you say, well, is China going to develop innovative companies, or are Chinese people going to be innovative? And I would say to you, well, since they dominate the US universities and the graduate schools, you're not going to have a lot of choice, right? Because, you know, they are in those. If there are going to be advances in science and technology, there are going to be a lot of Chinese and Indians and Americans in there. And so they would be among the most innovative people in the world.
And in fact, we've already seen, we're here in California, where immigrants have launched all of these tremendous companies. We're using a technology here, Zoom, from a Chinese American company, right?
That's right.
So, so the innovation's already happening. And as you mentioned, we have so many students and on our campuses, and we have some people who are concerned about this.
Yeah. So I was going to get to the point of, so if you're in that situation, and science and technology and innovation are driven a lot by the US and China, how do you decouple that, right? How do you, as we know, American venture capital firms and investment funds invest in the best technology companies in China, and China wants to invest in the best technology companies in the US. Right. Chinese companies are listing in the US. So there is so much integration in there. There's up until recently, I don't know about now, but all the major American universities were going and partnering with Chinese universities, doing research together, or professors. A lot of my friends, they're professors in the US and they have labs in China, and they have students in China working on their projects, which might be later called an American project, or they won the Nobel Prize for this professor at an American university, but actually a lot of the research was done in China, medical research, etc. I really don't know if these tensions continue and if there is sort of a crackdown or a threat about the integration, how that will be decided and how ugly and damaging that could be to Chinese who want to study in the US and who are not stealing technology, but also turning away if the US decides to turn away lots of these Chinese and others, not just Chinese, if we feel like so paranoid. I do recognize that there have been so many cases involving Chinese that there is worry, not just among the US government, but even, you know, people at the universities who worry that maybe they're at risk. And I don't know what the solution is, but it's something, when I said at the beginning that I think this is one of the most important topics, I think it needs to be written about, talked about, thought through, because it is so important to what happens in the next 10 years in the US and in China, in about how we solve our problems and about how we use the technologies. I've also been told that American companies worry that China is going to get ahead of certain technologies, and because those great scientists are going to be sent back, or they're going to leave, or they're going to be frustrated in the US, that the US is going to fall behind even more if they're, you know, I'm not saying that they're behind now, but some people think they're falling behind, that is going to be a very difficult challenge for them. And yet at the same time, I don't know what you do if you have two countries suspicious and not trusting of the other. If China cracks down on its end and the US cracks down on this end, what's going to happen to the future of innovation? And what's going to happen to the open university? What's going to happen to the idea of the free flow of information? So I think a lot of things need to be worked out or need to be debated openly and frankly.
Now, this is a giant topic, and in fact, one that the US-China Institute is quite focused on. We have several programs coming up that will be addressing this. But you speak to the question of the open university, and that's a central issue. You want to be able to interact with students without saying you're a Chinese student.
Right.
You want to be able to, you know, you're a fellow scientist, and you don't want the national status of someone to be the determinative one in terms of collaboration and trying to move forward. David, if you can forgive me, we are up against some time pressures. I wanted to shift gears, and I'm prompted too by one of our friends who's asked a question, Ira Kassoff, who's raised the question of the status of journalists from Western news organizations in China. Now, you're somebody who, of course, attracted a lot of attention yourself with your reporting, and you were on the ground for a number of years. And of course, you have a lot of friends, colleagues who have been working there in recent years, and perhaps some who were working there at the start of the year and are not able to work there today. What do you know about conditions for journalists in China today?
Well, I would say from my own experience, I went to China in 2004. It was an amazing almost 12 years for me in China. I started to feel that things changed a little after the Olympics. As you probably know, up until the Olympics, the Chinese government was more and more open with the global media, the foreign media, and saying, now you can travel more openly throughout China. You don't need all these passes and restrictions, although we'll still follow you a lot. I felt it was getting more and more open. after the financial crisis, after the Olympics, they did slowly tighten things and became more worried. And I think the problem was they felt before the Olympics, they just were eager to have, you know, some positive coverage in respect of China by having lots of media there. After it, I think the Chinese government started to feel that the media, the foreign media, could be pretty harsh on China. And there's lots of things happening in China that they were free to see. And so they got kind of tired of the scandal reporting, including by the New York Times, and said, you know, by the time I was in my final years, I think they were quite frustrated that that the journalists, including myself, could even write about the wealth of the Chinese leaders. And I would say they didn't want us to write about Tibet. They didn't want to write about Taiwan or a lot of Tiananmen Square, the three T's. But the most sensitive thing was writing about the families of senior leaders. But as a journalist, a lot of us on the ground felt that was our duty to write about everything that we found. And in fact, in a lot of the deals with the senior leaders that we found, there were sometimes involvement of American or Western companies. So we were just reporting what we found. So things got more and more problematic in the end of my term. As you probably know, Michael Forsyth got death threats for his coverage. I got death threats after our coverage of the Prime Minister's family. My wife was threatened. Lots of things got pretty ugly, and the New York Times was blocked after my story in 2012, and it's still blocked 7 years later. So I kind of saw the spiral, you know, downward, that the relations were not going to get better, and the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal were going to do great reporting, whether the Chinese government liked it or not. And so in a way, I wasn't surprised. I was surprised that all three organizations and Voice of America and others were kicked out together, but I knew it was a difficult situation. I knew the Chinese government felt more and more confident. We're wealthier, we're stronger, we have a strong leader with unlimited terms, and so that they might do something like this. So obviously from my standpoint, it's really tragic, unfortunate. Chris Buckley, my former colleague, spent, I think, almost 20 years or about 20 years in China, one of the best reporters I think that we've ever had in China, that he has to leave. He's not even an American citizen.
He's an Australian.
Yeah. So, you know, this is really going to make it difficult to tell the China story, to understand China for anyone inside China or outside, because those were very, some of the very best reporters. And I won't say there won't continue to be great reporting from China. There are some good Chinese reporters and other countries' reporters, but this was a pretty serious blow to have the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal all out at once. And it also sends a message to anyone reporting on China. And I think it not only sends a message to people who are inside China, it sends a message to news organizations outside of China, right? And that's what I think they like to do, is to intimidate and put a sense of fear in journalists who cover. And so we've got a more difficult job. It's going to probably even get more difficult than it is, but journalists are part of their job is to always try to figure out a way to tell a story when it's very difficult. And I think the best journalists will continue to cover China in a way that tells that story, whether they're based there or not.
Yeah, it's very clear that first of all, there are a lot of good journalists. Not all of them work for the three targeted publications,
right?
And so that's the first point. The second point is that even people like Austin Ramsey and others who had to work outside of China still made good use of those opportunities. And Chris Buckley has the world's greatest electronic Rolodex If he chooses to, he can continue to use it. So I'm confident about that. The Chinese government, of course, says, hey, we didn't start this. We didn't start this. You started this. The United States started this by identifying our media organizations as state entities, step one. Step two, limiting the number of visas we could have. Now, you didn't target specific journalists, but you said 60 have to leave, right? That sort of thing. And so that's the Chinese government's response. What is your take on that? Is the United States making a mistake in limiting the number of Chinese journalists, people working for Chinese state media, to be in the United States?
Yeah, I've heard this argument before. I mean, I do think that tactically, the U.S. government making that move at that time probably was a bad move, because it gave the Chinese government an excuse to do this. But in my mind, and I think Chris Buckley was on limited visas at the end of his term anyway, I think they were, I mean, remember, the Sick Man of Asia headline led to other journalists. So they needed an excuse. The real thing was they were figuring out how to justify getting rid of journalists other than just blocking their, like saying, we're going to censor your website. Well, now we need to just censor you, get you out of the country. And so we need something. So who knows, maybe they did something we don't know that sort of triggered the US reacting back. But I think if the US didn't do, I mean, it may have been a technical mistake, but if the US didn't do it, they would have found another headline or another excuse to do the same thing, to get rid of the reporters. That's the bottom line. Is they could have kicked out many reporters. Like choosing these three organizations, I think, was intentional. And I think it shows it wasn't about a headline or about what the US did. They needed a way to get rid of journalists.
Yeah, no, I quite agree. I think there was a list, and when the opportunity presented itself, they went down the list.
Yes.
People who've been reporting on Huawei in Africa, people who've been reporting on Xinjiang, these sorts of things, we can do without them.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
That sort of thing. David, I want to morph into a discussion about your new project. And one of the things, when we spoke to you for Assignment China, you mentioned that one of the ways that you wound up reporting on Wen Jiabao was that you would, in the course of your life, you would just go to different meetings, dinner parties, and things like that. And then afterwards, you would type up what you remembered that people shared and things like that. And you've said about the Wire China that one of the goals is that all of this information be made somehow more usable, more accessible, that it doesn't disappear after one story is written. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're trying to do with the Wire China?
Sure. So, I mean, one of the things I've thought about going way back is I love research. I love archives. I've kept all my files since I began reporting. And I've always felt it's a shame that so many journalists throw away this valuable information. And also, I often use it and look back. When I'm looking at a news story, I'll go back through my emails from even 10 years ago, and I'll say, wait a minute, I have something that can inform the story now, or something is in my folder. So I wanted to find a way to make use of my records and actually to be more efficient. And so one of the projects that we started here is I started to digitize all of my records so that instead of going through the folders and files and old notes, that I could just search that digitally. And I also, for a long time, wanted to figure out a way to cover China in a broader way than I was doing at the New York Times, by which I mean, I wanted to write a little about, do Q&As with people who had written books about China or had interesting things. you may know that for a lot of journalists, you do an interview with someone, they talk to you for an hour or two, and there ends up being 2 sentences for them in the story, and sometimes no sentence, and then they're very frustrated, and or they feel like they were not quoted in full or in context. And I felt if we could only have a Q&A with a lot of those like very interesting interviews that I had to just put into my file and say, some other time. So I wanted to build a magazine where we would have a Q&A, we would have a book section, we would have investigative reporting, in-depth reporting. It would be more based on research because I'm really a researcher. I love doing research. And also, to be honest, when I was leaving China, I thought my story list when I left China after almost 12 years was I still had hundreds of stories that I hadn't finished. And I thought some of these are great stories. How am I going to eventually tell these stories if I'm leaving China? And so all of these things kind of coalesced in, I wanted to be involved with data. I wanted to be involved with research and archives. I wanted to be sort of document this period in Chinese history, interview a lot of the important people in business, finance, economics. Also, at some point, be able to make a lot of these records available to a broader audience, even maybe other journalists who could come in and use those records as long as they're not sensitive or anonymous sources or something. And so this was the idea around building a news organization that would also have an internal database, which frankly, most news organization people told me is a crazy idea. Like, we don't want a database, we don't want archives, we don't want your stuff. So a lot of people laughed at this idea, but I sort of love the concept of building an archive, using that, improving it, using the new tools of technology. Like even like the recent interviews I've been doing, I've been transcribing them through these AI programs. So it's a new way to do journalism, to try to take advantage of those tools, to save those records, to analyze the records in a different way, and to try to produce in-depth journalism about a topic that I don't want to give up. I love the topic of China, and there's so many stories. You'll never get to the end of the stories you want to write about China. And there's probably, I didn't think about this when we came up with the idea, but there's no more urgent and important time to be writing on the topic than right now.
Yeah, no, the Wire China arrives at this crucial moment. And many of the articles in the first issues of the Wire China, get at this U.S.-China nexus quite nicely. The policymakers, but also some of the people who are in between, right? The business people that are making these kinds of things happen. And so we understand you. We understand your passion, your obsession. How did you get others to come along? And how did you get venture capitalists to come in to support this? Right now, journalism is on the ropes in many places.
Yeah. So to be honest, they were more interested in data than news. Most of the people that I convinced, I said, one of the beautiful things is we have an enormous amount of data. And one of the secrets has been my wife and partner, Lynn, has worked for me in the New York Times for the last 15 years. And she was helping build the databases. When we covered H&A Group, she would build out the data. She would organize the data, translate the data, set up the data. And then, as I said,
David, if I could interrupt,
away. Sure.
If I could interrupt for just a minute H&A has been in the headlines, maybe not this week. Maybe you can explain why that was a difficult set of data to unpack.
Sure.
Tell us something about H&A and the role that your wife played and in unpacking that story.
Yeah. So actually in 2017, I guess it was, I was at 2016, I came to Harvard and worked on a fellowship to see, could we build this news and database? And I went back to the New York Times and they said, well, you've got this big database, you say, that you worked with Lynn on. Could you pick a company and show us like what we can learn from your database? And we picked H&A. And the reason we picked it was doing multi-billion-dollar deals in the US. It was very aggressive. I think it might have been 20 or 30 billion dollars buying up hotels, assets in all over the world. Frankly, I knew nothing about H&A except it was part of an airline group.
Right.
So once we started looking at the data, this was kind of became a case study in trying to understand if you're looking at the data being corporate ownership data, the relationships between companies and people. So for the next 6 to 9 months, maybe even a year, I spent with Lynn looking at what we thought started out as sort of like one company became 100 companies, became, I'm not joking, her going through the records of over 1,000 companies and understanding that some of the movement in the relationship and the ownership was very problematic. For instance, in Europe, H&A might say, well, our largest shareholder is this person. And in the US, they would say our largest shareholder is a different person. And I think in one of the cases, the largest shareholder of this 50 billion or $100 billion company was a 27-year-old guy who no one had ever heard of and is living in a, squalid apartment in Beijing. So that was sort of a case study for us in understanding how to examine a company like H&A, which had 22 or 23 publicly traded companies, over 1,000 privately held companies, connections all over the world, hotels. And so we spent, I think I wrote 5 or 6 sort of investigative stories for the New York Times about H&A. And it sort of proved the case that for us, that this database can be very powerful, not only in telling you things about the ownership of a company, but some of the important questions about what is the corporate governance of that company. And as you probably recall, Enron, which I covered in 2001 and 2002, it ended up being a corporate governance issue. A lot of insider deals, off the books transactions. H&A, very similar in some ways. Related party transactions, relatives of the senior executives on all sides of transactions, money flowing back and forth. So it was a great study for us to think about not only how to understand Chinese data, but how to integrate that with data from the US, from data from Europe, data from the Panama Papers, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. Well, and so that, that case study proves the model, right? That's what you're looking at. And in the first issues of the Wire China, you've highlighted other noteworthy companies, right? Luckin Coffee, you have a profile up now of Jia Yueting, and this kind of thing. Maybe you could say something more about why, because we are so tied together, because the Chinese economy matters so much, why this kind of work is so critical.
I would say because, I mean, you actually answered it there, because in the case of Jia Yueting, so here is one of the most important, for a while, internet tycoons in China, right? He was supposed to be the Netflix of China and video streaming, and then he was going to be the Tesla of China. Here is a billionaire from China living in Los Angeles, spending billions of dollars on a rival to Tesla. He was also tied to a corruption investigation involving one of the senior Chinese leaders. So there were all sorts of different elements. And when I go into a story, I try to first ask myself, just, is this interesting? I don't know what the single answer is, good, bad, or whatever. I don't try to make simple judgments. I just say, are there interesting elements here, and can I document it? So the reporting that we're doing is not based on sources, anonymous sources or people that give us tips. It's based on, can we find documentary evidence that helps tell a story? Now, maybe once in a while we talk to someone who points us to things, but generally it's going back through the documentation and asking the questions. And I think since there's so much Chinese investment in the US investment in China, China investment all over the world, I think we should know more about the stories. And I don't write the story saying there shouldn't be Chinese investment in the US. I'm just telling the stories and trying to tell as many stories as possible, and even complicated stories. I'm not trying to give simple answers. So here is a storytelling involving interesting people, interesting companies, lots of money, lots at stake. I want to sort of unfold that story for you, show you the documentation, and hopefully give you a broader picture of what's going on.
Well, and the example you've just given, you of course demonstrated that with the Prime Minister story, the Wen Jiabao family fortune, and there was talk, of course, there were a lot of people that said somebody gave you that story. One of Wen Jiabao's enemies gave you that story, or some intelligence service gave you that story, and you showed us, no, I dug it up. I dug it up. And so this data-driven journalism, data-driven not in the sense that it's all about quantification, but rather digging, and finding these potential sources. Now I know why I'm reading The Wire China. I would read you wherever you went, whatever you did, but also I found the publication really quite interesting. What do you know about your subscribers? Who do you think is somebody who would profit from reading?
Well, we're only a month in, so we just got going, so we don't know a whole lot. I can tell you, as you probably know, it's kind of almost troubling to see what you can, not about the identities of the people, but if you have Google Analytics, you can know where they're, what countries they're from. And so what we know is, 54% are coming from the US. We've had a lot of traffic in these first 4 weeks. About 10% is coming from China, that's second. And so almost close to 50% is coming from outside of the US, which is great. It's not a huge surprise that China, Hong Kong, Singapore, Australia, and Canada are way up on that list. So we're starting to understand in the early weeks where some of the subscribers are coming from. And we're trying to understand how to market better and how to price and all that. But I think as far as your question is, obviously I want to target this to people who follow China, like yourself, who want another sort of in-depth reporting vehicle to understand China better. And not many, as you probably know, not many publications now have a book section. And so we have a China book section, a lot of business, a lot of non-business. And so we want to do it different. We want to focus on those people that are very interested in China. That's the front lines of who we want to target. But I do want the publication to be broader and to be read by people who are not China-focused people, because in the end, if it's such a small niche audience, I'm not so sure we can survive. And also, when I left the New York Times, I'm leaving a publication where the audience is, 30 to 50 million. And so do I really want to write for a small group subset that probably was reading me in the New York Times? So I want to do something a little different. I want to use the data. I want to start with the people that would be most likely to be focused on China, but try to build it in a way that other publications would be interested, companies would be interested maybe in the data and on other things. And also I wanted to play with graphics and try to illustrate, one of the things I've always loved to do is work with the graphics team to build an illustration for the story, and we get to do that at this publication. So it's my effort to experiment, to write about different subjects, and to try to put my imprint on how do you think about China in this variety and with this approach.
Now, it's an exciting time, and absolutely the most appropriate time for you to be entering into this space with both, the data approach and also the journalism. We've got a ton of questions,
Okay.
some of which we've addressed.
Okay.
We've talked about higher education. We've talked a little bit. There's a couple of questions about some of your specific New York Times colleagues that maybe we'll leave. You could type in an answer
Okay.
to that a little bit later. But one question that really resonates with me, and we will wrap up in just a moment, is, for example, the Chinese news assistants, the staff in the Times Bureau, them being ordered not to work, for the Times. But you, of course, worked with your wife, but with others, and also the role for Chinese journalists in the United States. At USC and at other schools, we have a lot of students who have come, they've studied economics, they've studied business, they've studied journalism. They're anxious to have their voices be part of this discussion. Can you say something about the relationship between Western journalists in China and their Chinese counterparts, and the opportunities for people who are ethnically Chinese in this field?
Sure. So first, if you go back to China, most of the foreign journalists have a research assistant / translator who helps them. So there are some that don't use one, but most do. I always had a research assistant, and they are some of the most remarkable. I mean, I had, I think, 6 in my 12 years there. I had some really incredible people. I mean, I think as good as anyone I could have worked with, and I did work with in the US. So they are not only really talented, but very brave, because as you can imagine, being a research assistant for the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post or CNN, it can be a very scary experience. And I did have assistants who came to me and said, their parents were contacted by the Chinese government, or they themselves were threatened about the work they were doing, and also they were often asked to spy on me and know what I was working on. So,
and they wanted to make sure they told you that.
Exactly. I trusted all of my research assistants, though, and they were remarkable to the day I left. In fact, I'm still in contact with many of them. So the Chinese journalists that I worked with at the New York Times, remarkable. And also, if you say, well, what about the Chinese journalists that are working at Chinese publications in China that we're competing with, say Caixin or Taijin Magazine or Southern Weekend or something. Also there is great journalism in China. And if there weren't censors, the Western media would have a very difficult time, because I can tell you there are some remarkable journalists in China. And obviously they have an advantage, and this is their first language, and they have better sources, and et cetera. So there's a lot of great journalists, but they do have the challenge of having censors and not being able to publish. And on occasion, some Chinese journalists would actually contact the foreign journalists or Western journalists and say, I have a tip for you about a story. So that's the part about China. In the US, obviously, a lot of Chinese journalists come to the US to study. And I would say almost all of my research assistants either had come back from the US, or after they worked for me, went to the US to study journalism. And so you've got remarkable people here. And there are publications now that Chinese-born journalists
Mhm.
are starting in the US. And obviously they are right now, because of the trade tensions, they're at risk, I guess. I mean, just like non-Chinese journalists are at risk, is with the visa situation, with being even Asian at a time of COVID. So there are a lot of challenges that worries me. Obviously, my wife is Chinese. So I don't know what really to say about that, except the more we talk about it, and we should all be concerned that Chinese could be targeted, suspicions put on them. Even some of my colleagues who are Asian but not Chinese have been blamed for COVID-19 for being Asian. So, but there's some really good journalists, as you know, here in the U.S., and I think that is going to continue to grow. And we're going to start to consider them not Chinese journalists, but just great journalists who happen to be Chinese.
Now, thank you for that answer. One kind of concluding question, and it's not a summation question, but a couple people have asked versions of this in the Q&A section, and that's to look beyond just US-China, but to look at China's connections with other regions. A couple of our Southern California colleagues have asked about, for example, Latin America, Brazil, but also other regions. And so, thus far the publication has obviously paid a lot more attention to US-China. It's a natural state of things, but China is a global phenomena. It's everywhere all the time now. Can you say something about its regional ties?
Yes. If I could have planted that question with you myself, because I love that question, because it just so happens that what we're trying to focus on with the magazine is we're not in China. We're not going to try to say that we're a magazine covering China and competing with people inside China. I'm in Boston. The idea of the magazine is to cover China from outside of China. And tomorrow, we're getting 2 stories that are coming in draft form, the first draft of 2 stories. One is from South Africa. That story has been in the works for a while, and so we're going to have a story about China in Africa from a guy who's writing from South Africa. The second story is from Prague. So from the Czech Republic, we're going to have another story that is written by people in Central Eastern Europe writing about China there. And we have assigned stories to writers in Australia, in Canada, actually we have a person in Latin America also. So we want, actually the more places I can include. We're starting out with what we know first, because there are so many people that I know that wrote for American publications and returned. So many former New York Times, Wall Street Journal, other publications who have settled back in the US or in the UK or in Canada can write for us. But I am reaching out. We actually have another writer who's in Korea who's writing for us. So to have reports from different parts of the world, so that eventually, I mean, you've only seen 5 issues, but we've got 48 issues a year, not 52. And I want those 48 issues to have increasingly diverse voices. You don't completely see it now, but the plan is the voices will become more diverse. The stories will become diverse. They'll be from different places. US, China will be a centerpiece because it's unavoidable. And it's also an advantage that we have being here, but also we want it to be global. And so the more global, like if people from this session called me and said, I'm in, I don't know, New Zealand, and I have a China story, I'd be like, great, we want stories from different parts of the world. So I hope as we get a readership and as we get more comfortable, you'll see more variety, because that is the goal of the magazine. And I think that also is something that we can say is our advantage, because most people in other parts of the world, even writing for the New York Times, front and center is not for them China, unless the editors call and say, there's a China story in your locale. We're looking for the China stories outside of China.
And that's a great way to end our conversation today. David, you've been so generous with your time. We're really thankful. We wish you the best with The Wire China. I hope that if our audience hasn't already clicked over there and taken a look, that they will soon. The next new issue goes up on Sunday. So new content on its way. For all those who have joined us, either through Zoom or on Facebook Live, thank you for giving us this time. We hope that you feel rewarded. I think you've gotten a very rich discussion featuring David Barboza, who knows this subject so very well. We touched on innovation as a topic. And in fact, 1 week from today at this time, we're going to be looking at the race to innovate. And we have one of the more successful venture capitalists who's going to be talking with us, Gary Reichel, somebody who David no doubt interviewed and met numerous times during the time that they shared in Shanghai. We hope that all of you will be with us again soon. And David, I hope the next time we get to do it in person.
Great, great. I'd love that. Thanks so much for hosting me here.